Here is a question that will change how you see wealth forever. If you handed $10 million to a random stranger and $10 million to a billionaire who had just lost everything, who do you think ends up richer in 10 years? Most people guess wrong. They assume money creates the outcome. It doesn't. In 1997, a man named John Paul DeJoria was living in his car, selling shampoo out of the trunk, door to door, collecting bottles to return for gas money. He wasn't handed capital. He wasn't born connected. What he had was something almost impossible to teach: a specific architecture of thought that made him treat rejection as information, not injury. Decades later, that same mind built a multi-billion-dollar empire from a product nobody asked for. Here's the uncomfortable truth this documentary is going to prove: billionaires are not better at making money. They are better at thinking. And the gap between their mind and yours isn't intelligence. It isn't luck. It's a set of mental operating rules so counterintuitive that most people reject them the moment they hear them. Because here's what nobody tells you. The richest people on earth often make decisions that look, on paper, completely irrational. They walk away from safe money. They stay obsessed with problems long after they've made more than they could ever spend. They treat failure the way most people treat breakfast, as something that simply happens before the real work of the day begins. So over the next 20 minutes, we are going to open up the mental architecture of extreme wealth. Not the Instagram version, not the yacht and private jet fantasy. The actual internal software, the way billionaires process time, risk, identity, and failure differently than 99.9% of the world. And by the end, you'll understand why simply copying what billionaires do, their schedules, their diets, their reading lists, will never make you one of them. Because you can't copy an outcome. You can only rebuild the thinking that produced it. Let's start with the single biggest difference of all, and it has nothing to do with money. It has to do with a resource far rarer than cash. Stick around, because the next case study will show you what happens when someone starts measuring their life in decades instead of days. In 1870, a 31-year-old former bookkeeper named John D. Rockefeller made a decision that horrified his own partners. Standard Oil was already profitable. It was already, by any measure of the era, a success. Most men would have taken the win. Rockefeller instead poured nearly every dollar of profit back into pipelines, refineries, and railroad contracts that wouldn't pay off for years. His partners wanted dividends. Rockefeller wanted infrastructure nobody else was patient enough to build. This is the first mental rule that separates billionaire thinking from everyday thinking, an almost pathological relationship with time. Where most people plan in months, billionaires plan in decades. Where most people ask, "What will this earn me this year?" billionaires ask, "What will this compound into by the time I'm no longer running this company?" There's a psychological term for this: temporal discounting. It describes how humans instinctively value a reward today far more than a larger reward tomorrow. Give most people the choice between $1,000 now or $5,000 in 5 years, and the majority take the smaller, faster prize. It's not stupidity, it's biology. Our brains evolved in environments where tomorrow was never guaranteed. But something breaks that wiring in extreme builders. Rockefeller wasn't just delaying gratification, he was operating on a timeline that barely resembled a normal human lifespan. He built for a version of Standard Oil he might not live to see fully realized. And this shows up again and again in extreme wealth creation. Amazon operated at a loss for years while Wall Street mocked it. The founders of Airbnb slept on air mattresses and got rejected by nearly every investor they approached, while quietly building toward a decade-long bet that a stranger's spare room could become a $100 billion industry. Here's what's fascinating and slightly disturbing. Researchers studying long-term entrepreneurial thinkers have found that this extended time horizon often comes at a personal cost. Rockefeller was infamous for his health collapsing under stress in his 50s, only recovering once he began giving away his fortune. The same obsession with the distant future that builds empires can quietly starve the present. So the first rule of billionaire thinking is this: they are not living in your calendar. They are running a different clock entirely, one where this year's sacrifice is simply the tuition for a decade from now. But time alone doesn't explain everything, because plenty of patient people never become wealthy. There's a second ingredient, and it's far more dangerous. It's how billionaires treat the possibility of losing everything. And the story of a woman who bet her entire life savings on a pair of footless pantyhose is about to show you exactly what that looks like. In 1998, a 27-year-old fax machine saleswoman named Sarah Blakely cut the feet off a pair of pantyhose to wear under white pants. She had $5,000 in savings, her entire financial cushion, and she spent it building a prototype for what would become Spanx. Every hosiery mill she pitched turned her down. Executives laughed at a nobody with no fashion background and no manufacturing experience. She kept going anyway, and today her name sits among the wealthiest self-made women alive. What makes this story useful isn't the success. It's the math she was running in her head before she ever spent that money. Blakely wasn't gambling $5,000 hoping to get $5,001 back. She understood, instinctively, something economists call asymmetric risk, a bet where the potential downside is small and survivable, but the potential upside is enormous and life-changing. This is the second core rule of billionaire cognition. They are obsessed with the shape of a bet, not just its odds. Most people evaluate risk by asking, how likely am I to win? Billionaire-minded thinkers ask a different question. If I lose, can I recover? And if I win, how much does it change my life? Think about what this means practically. Losing $5,000 was painful for Blakely, but it wasn't fatal. She could rebuild. But if Spanx worked, it wasn't going to make her a little richer, it was going to reshape her entire existence. That lopsided relationship between limited downside and unlimited upside is precisely the equation billionaires hunt for again and again across completely different industries. Compare that to how most people are taught to think about money. Minimize risk, protect what you have, avoid embarrassment. That advice isn't wrong for stability, but it is structurally incapable of producing outlier wealth because outlier wealth requires outlier bets. Here's the twist almost nobody talks about. This kind of thinking isn't reckless, it's actually more disciplined than caution because it demands brutal honesty about worst-case scenarios before ever placing the bet. Blakely calculated exactly what losing that $5,000 would cost her lifestyle. She wasn't hoping. She had already survived the loss in her mind before she risked it in real life. And that mental rehearsal of failure actually sitting inside the worst outcome before it happens leads us directly into the third and strangest rule of billionaire psychology. Because the people who build the biggest fortunes on earth don't fear failure the way you'd expect. Some of them collect it, and the man who turned that collection into a science is about to show you why. Charlie Munger, the late investing partner of Warren Buffett, spent decades building something he called a latticework of mental models, a collection of ideas borrowed from psychology, physics, biology, and history, used specifically to catch his own bad thinking before it caused real damage. Munger's obsession wasn't picking winners. It was building a system to identify, in advance, all the specific ways a smart person deceives themselves. This reveals the third rule: billionaire thinkers treat their own mistakes as data, not identity. When an average investor loses money, the emotional experience is often something like, I am bad at this, I am foolish, I should be embarrassed. Munger's framework stripped emotion out almost entirely. A loss wasn't a verdict on his worth as a person. It was information about a flaw in the model that needed patching. People with a strong internal locus of control tend to examine failure for lessons. People with an external locus of control tend to blame circumstances, luck, or other people. Extreme builders consistently sit at the far end of the internal spectrum, sometimes to an almost uncomfortable degree, taking responsibility even for events partly outside their hands. But there's a deeper layer here that most content about learning from failure misses entirely. It's not just that billionaires analyze mistakes. It's that they've often restructured their sense of self so that failure doesn't threaten it in the first place. Their identity isn't built on being right. It's built on being someone who solves problems, and solving problems requires being wrong constantly along the way. Compare this to how most people are raised. School rewards correct answers and punishes wrong ones with a red mark and a lower grade. By the time most of us reach adulthood, we've spent 12 to 16 years being trained to associate being wrong with shame. Munger and thinkers like him essentially had to unlearn that entire conditioning as adults, replacing it with something closer to a scientist's relationship to a failed experiment, mildly curious, rarely devastated. This is why so many billionaires can describe their biggest losses in vivid, specific detail, almost cheerfully, while an average person can barely bring themselves to talk about a failed business at a dinner party. One group experienced failure as narrative. The other experienced it as trauma. And this leads to something even stranger, a psychological trait so unusual that most wealthy people themselves can't fully explain it. It's the reason billionaires keep working long after the money has stopped meaning anything at all. That's coming up next. Here's a pattern that confuses almost everyone watching from the outside. Why does someone worth $11 billion still wake up at 5 in the morning to run the same company for another decade? If the goal was money, the goal was achieved years ago, and yet the behavior doesn't change. Warren Buffett has lived in the same modest house in Omaha since 1958, long after his net worth crossed into the tens of billions. He didn't stay there because he couldn't afford somewhere else. He stayed because, at a certain point, his relationship with money had quietly transformed from a way to acquire things into something closer to a scoreboard, a way of measuring whether his decisions were correct, completely detached from lifestyle. This is the fourth rule, and it's the one most people misunderstand the most. For extreme builders, money eventually stops functioning as currency and starts functioning as feedback. The number in the account isn't there to be spent. It's there to answer a single question: was I right? This reframing does something powerful to decision-making. If money is purely for spending, every financial decision gets weighed against lifestyle upgrades: a bigger house, a faster car, comfort. But if money is feedback, comfort becomes almost irrelevant, and the entire focus shifts toward the accuracy of your judgment over time. That's a fundamentally different game, played by a fundamentally different set of rules. It also explains something that looks, from the outside, like obsession or even dysfunction. Many billionaires describe an almost restless discomfort with stillness and inability to simply enjoy what they've built without immediately identifying the next unsolved problem. Psychologists who study high-achievement populations have noted this pattern repeatedly. The goal was never actually the money. The money was a byproduct of chasing something else entirely: mastery, or the specific pleasure of solving a problem nobody else could. This is precisely why lottery winners so often end up broke within a few years, while self-made billionaires rarely do, even after losing fortunes multiple times over. The lottery winner acquired money without acquiring the underlying relationship to it. The billionaire's wealth is inseparable from an internal operating system built to generate it again and again, in any conditions, because the wealth was never really the destination. But if the money isn't the point, what is? What's actually running underneath all of this? The decades-long time horizons, the asymmetric bets, the immunity to failure, the strange indifference to comfort. There's a common thread tying every one of these traits together, and it's hiding in plain sight in almost every billionaire biography ever written. Let's pull it out into the open. Strip away the industries, the decades, the personalities, and a single thread runs underneath Rockefeller's oil empire, Blakely's shapewear company, Munger's mental models, and Buffett's modest house in Omaha. It's this: every one of them fused their identity to a problem, not to an outcome. Rockefeller didn't identify as a rich man. He identified as the person solving the chaos and waste of the early oil industry. Blakely didn't identify as an entrepreneur chasing a payday. She identified as the person who was going to fix a specific discomfort millions of women quietly lived with. Munger didn't identify as an investor. He identified as a person building better tools for thinking. The money, in every single case, was the exhaust from an engine built to solve something else. This matters because it explains something that trips up almost everyone who tries to reverse engineer wealth from the outside. If you chase the outcome directly, the money, the title, the lifestyle, you're optimizing for a moving target that provides no internal compass when things get difficult. But if you fuse your identity to a specific problem, the difficulty itself becomes meaningful because every failure is simply more information about the problem you've committed to solving. Extrinsic motivation is fragile. It collapses the moment the reward feels far away or uncertain. Intrinsic motivation, tied to identity and problem solving, can survive years of rejection because the reward isn't waiting at the end. It's built into the daily act of working on the problem itself. This is why so many billionaires describe their early struggling years, paradoxically, as some of the most fulfilling of their lives, not despite the hardship, but almost because of it. The hardship was proof they were inside the problem, wrestling with something real, rather than performing the appearance of success. And this is precisely the piece that no amount of copying someone's morning routine, reading list, or wardrobe can replicate. You cannot borrow someone else's fused identity. You can only build your own, around a problem specific enough to survive years of rejection and vague enough in its final form that solving it well could reshape an entire industry. So where does that leave you, someone watching this, likely without $10 million, without a Rockefeller-sized head start, without a Munger-level latticework already built in your head? The answer isn't as far away as it seems, and it's exactly where we're going to land this conversation. Let's return to the question we opened with. Hand $10 million to a random stranger and $10 million to a billionaire who just lost everything, and in a decade, the billionaire is almost always richer again. Not because of connections, not because of some hidden safety net, because money was never the asset in the first place. The asset was the thinking that built it, and thinking is the one thing that survives every bankruptcy, every market crash, every failed product launch. Here's what we've uncovered. Billionaires run on a different clock, willing to sacrifice years for outcomes most people can't even picture. They chase asymmetric bets where the downside is survivable and the upside is life-altering, having already mentally rehearsed the worst case before risking a single dollar. They treat failure as raw data about a flawed model, not as a verdict on their worth. Their relationship with money quietly transforms from spending power into feedback, which is why comfort stops being the goal long before the money stops arriving. And underneath all of it, their identity fuses to a problem rather than an outcome, which is the only thing capable of sustaining years of effort before any reward appears. None of this requires starting with capital. Rockefeller started as a bookkeeper. Blakely started with $5,000 and a fax machine job. Munger started as a lawyer who hadn't yet made a single investment. What none of them started with was the belief that they needed permission, comfort, or certainty before beginning. So here's the real question this documentary leaves you with. Not how do I get rich? That question keeps you chasing an outcome that will never feel like enough once you arrive. The better question is this: what problem are you willing to stay obsessed with long after it stops being comfortable, long before anyone else believes it's worth solving? Because that obsession, not the money it eventually produces, is the actual asset every single person in this documentary was quietly building long before the world ever called them a billionaire. If this rewired the way you think about wealth, you already know what to do next. Subscribe, because the next mind we're going to take apart built an empire from a single decision everyone around them called insane, and it's a story you have not heard before.